So today, we're going to tackle a massive question. How on earth did Europe, a continent that basically helped invent the modern world, fall so far behind in the one technology that matters most, semiconductors? It's a fascinating and honestly a cautionary tale. Let's get into it. Okay, first things first. Just look at these numbers. I mean, they tell you everything you need to know. Europe went from making almost half of the world's semiconductors to now less than 10%. This wasn't just a slow decline, It was a complete and total free fall from a position of leadership. The scale of it is just staggering. So that's the big question we're asking today, right? How does a pioneer, someone who was literally there at the creation of an industry, end up watching from the sidelines? Well, the answer starts right at the very beginning. And this part of the story might actually surprise you. Europe wasn't just some minor player in the early days. No, it was right there at the starting line, neck and neck with the United States. A true, but now forgotten, pioneer. Just look at this timeline. We all know the story of Bell Labs inventing the transistor in 1947. But what most people don't know is that just months later, in Paris, two scientists came up with a nearly identical device they called the transistron. The French government was so excited, they held a huge press conference and even started building a factory. Europe was in the game from day one. But here is the first critical fumble. The French government, completely spooked by the dawn of the nuclear age, abruptly changed course. They pivoted all their national resources toward developing nuclear tech and just cut the funding for communications. And without that government backing, the transistron project just died on the vine. Its inventors left, and the first huge opportunity was gone. Just like that. Okay, so let's fast forward to the 1960s, because this decade was absolutely crucial. This was a period just littered with strategic mistakes that created a gap between Europe and the US that honestly, they would never be able to close. And this right here gets to the absolute heart of the problem. In America, all the demand for chips was coming from the military and the Apollo space program. They needed tiny, powerful, super reliable chips, and they did not care what it cost. That forced insane levels of innovation. Meanwhile, in Europe, the demand was all from consumer electronics, where the only thing that mattered was being as cheap as possible. And the data from back then, from 1963, just confirms this completely. Look, more than half the demand in West Germany and over a third in France was from that price-sensitive consumer market. And in the United States, a tiny 5%. You see, Europe was playing a totally different and frankly, much less ambitious game. So this obsession with cost led to a whole chain of terrible decisions. The European giants, they stuck with the older, cheaper germanium technology because they just saw chips as another simple component, not a core technology. They completely, totally missed the boat on the high-performance silicon transistors that the Americans were perfecting. They were basically betting on the wrong horse entirely. When you look back, the 1960s were really it. That was Europe's last best chance to actually lead the semiconductor industry. And that chance, it was lost. For good. And after that, the gap just became a chasm. Because the 1970s brought on a revolution in complexity that was going to raise the stakes and the price of entry to a whole different level. The big game changer was something called large-scale integration, or LSI. This is where you go from having just a few transistors on a chip to having thousands, which gave us the very first microprocessors. But here's the catch. Making these things required an absolutely enormous amount of money. The industry was changing from a workshop business into a high-tech, high-cost monster. And Europe had two huge problems that stopped it from making this jump. First off, it wasn't one big market. It was a messy collection of separate countries, each with its own rules and standards. That killed any chance of building things at scale. And second, there just wasn't enough demand for these fancy new chips. The computer, military, and telecom industries were all just too small to justify the investment. So we roll into the 80s and 90s, and this is where we see the final act of this story. A bunch of poorly timed government policies completely failed, right as a whole new group of competitors from Asia was rising up to take over the industry for good. By this point, the economic pain was becoming impossible to ignore. By 1985, Europe's IT trade deficit had ballooned to nearly $7 billion. The alarm bells weren't just ringing, they were screaming. But the response was, well, too little too late. So the governments finally tried to step in with these big state-funded programs. But the timing was just completely wrong. And you know what's even crazier? The European companies themselves didn't even want to work with each other. They'd rather partner up with their American and Japanese rivals. So these massive pan-European projects just fell apart as company after company pulled out. And by the 1990s, the game was over. The center of the semiconductor universe had moved decisively to Asia. Companies we all know now, like TSMC and Samsung, they were the new giants. Europe was left to fight over the scraps, surviving only in these small, specialized niche markets. So why does any of this history matter today? Well, because losing the chip race wasn't just a single event. It set off this devastating chain reaction, a domino effect that is still hurting Europe's economy right now. You can see the dominoes fall one by one. First, they lost the foundational hardware, the chips. Because of that, they were totally sidelined during the personal computer boom. With no major PC hardware platform, a dominant software industry never really took hold. And without that software layer, there was no foundation to build the big tech and internet giants that define our economy today. You can literally trace decades of slower growth right back to losing that one thing, the chip. The founder of AMD, Jerry Sanders, famously once said, "Real men have fabs." But when you look at the economic fate of an entire continent, maybe the quote really should be, "Real countries have fabs." It's a provocative thought, for sure, but it really shows you how central this industry has become to national power and prosperity.